On a Saturday evening in October 1858, in the industrial city of Bradford, England, a man known to the locals as Humbug Billy sold 5 pounds of peppermint lozenges from his stall in the green market. The sweets looked a little darker than usual. He'd noticed that when he picked them up from his supplier earlier that day, and he'd negotiated a discount because of it, a halfpenny less per pound. By the time the market closed at 11:30 that night, roughly 1,000 sweets had been handed across his counter to factory workers, children, and families heading home for the weekend. By Sunday morning, 2 boys, aged 9 and 14, sons of a man named John Scott, were dead. A third victim, a man named Elijah Wright, was dead shortly after. By Sunday evening, the death toll was still climbing, and more than 200 people across the district were violently ill. The youngest to die was 17 months old. The oldest was a grown man in otherwise good health. The police initially suspected cholera. Bradford had seen outbreaks before, and the symptoms were identical, but when the pattern became clear, every victim had purchased sweets from the same stall on the same night. A constable named Campbell traced the chain backward from the market stall to the confectioner's workshop to a druggist's attic 5 miles away. What he found was not a crime. It was something worse. It was a sequence of ordinary mistakes, made by ordinary people in a system where no regulation existed to catch any of them. The chain began with sugar. In 1850s England, sugar was expensive, taxed as a luxury import, priced beyond what most confectioners could afford to use in full. To keep their products cheap enough for working-class customers, sweet makers routinely replaced a portion of the sugar in their recipes with a substance they called daft. The name varied by region. Some called it molten or flash or simply stuff. What it actually was, in most cases, was powdered gypsum, plaster of Paris, ground fine enough to dissolve into a candy mixture without detection. It added bulk, reduced cost, and, as far as anyone knew, did no particular harm. It was not a secret. It was standard practice. There was no law against it, because there was no law governing what went into candy at all. Joseph Neal was the confectioner who supplied Humbug Billy's stall. He operated out of a workshop on Stone Street, a few hundred yards from the green market. When he needed to make a new batch of peppermint lozenges, Neal sent his lodger, a man named James Archer, to purchase 12 pounds of daft from a druggist in the nearby town of Shipley. The druggist's name was Charles Hodgson. Hodgson was ill in bed that day. His shop was being run by an assistant named William Goddard, a young man who had been working there for only 3 weeks, hoping to earn an apprenticeship. When Archer asked for the daft, Goddard went upstairs to the attic. He found 2 barrels, identical in size and appearance, standing side by side. One contained gypsum. The other contained arsenic trioxide, a white crystalline powder used as a pesticide and wood preservative, visually indistinguishable from plaster of Paris. The barrel of arsenic was labeled, but only on its base, a detail invisible to anyone reaching into it from above. If you've been watching this channel, you already know how stories like this end, and why they matter. Every episode follows the same arc, a hidden danger, a system with no safeguards, and the moment the rules finally change. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the chain of mistakes in this story is about to get worse. And here's a question for the comments. Have you ever bought candy without looking at the ingredients? In 1858, there were no ingredients to look at. Goddard measured out 12 pounds of white powder from the wrong barrel and handed it to Archer, who carried it back to Neal's workshop on Stone Street. Neither man knew what had just happened. There was no requirement that the barrels be clearly labeled, no regulation mandating that toxic substances be stored separately from food-grade materials, no law requiring a druggist's assistant to have any particular training or knowledge of what he was selling. Goddard had been on the job for 21 days. Neal handed the powder to James Appleton, an experienced sweet maker in his employ. Appleton combined 40 pounds of sugar with the 12 pounds of what he believed was gypsum, added 4 pounds of gum and a measure of peppermint oil, heated the mixture, and shaped it into lozenges. He noticed something was different. The mixture was smoother and more free-flowing than usual. The finished lozenges were darker than the batches he was accustomed to making. During the process, working in close proximity to the powder, Appleton himself became ill, vomiting and experiencing pain in his hands and arms. He assumed he had caught a stomach ailment. He did not connect his sickness to the sweets. Neal, who tasted the lozenges as a quality check, also vomited. He, too, attributed it to something unrelated. 40 pounds of peppermint lozenges, every one of them containing arsenic trioxide, were packed up and delivered to Humbug Billy's stall at the green market. Hardacre noticed the color was off. He did not throw them away. He negotiated a lower price and put them on sale. That evening, he ate one himself. By 5:30, he was too ill to stand behind his counter. He went home and left his assistant to sell the rest. By the time the stall closed, 5 pounds of candy had been distributed across the district, sold in packages of 10 to 12 lozenges at a time, which meant that entire families sat down on Saturday evening and shared the same bag of sweets. Each lozenge, a chemist named Felix Remington would later calculate, contained between 14 and 15 grains of arsenic trioxide. The recognized lethal dose was 4.5 grains. Every single sweet held more than 3 times the amount needed to end a life. Enough candy had been sold, by Hardacre's own later estimate, to kill 2,000 people. people. The first deaths came that same night. By Sunday morning, October 31st, the police were informed that 2 boys, the sons of John Scott, aged 9 and 14, had died, along with a man named Elijah Wright. The initial diagnosis was cholera. It was a reasonable mistake. Bradford had been struck by cholera before, and the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, violent stomach pain, uncontrollable vomiting, were nearly indistinguishable from the disease. But as the hours passed, more reports arrived. Then more. Families across the district were collapsing. The pattern pointed to something specific, something local, something shared. What saved most of them was a bellman. Police Constable Campbell made the connection between the sweets and the deaths and traced the chain back to Hardaker's stall. He seized the remaining stock, just under 36 pounds of lozenges, still sitting behind the counter, still for sale. A district bellman was dispatched through the streets of Bradford on Sunday night, ringing his bell and shouting warnings to anyone who had purchased peppermint sweets from the green market the evening before. Physicians were mobilized to administer what antidotes they could. The bellman's rounds likely saved hundreds of lives. Families who had bought the sweets but hadn't yet eaten them threw the lozenges away. By the time the bell stopped ringing, the toll was clear. 7 adults and 13 children were dead. The youngest was 17 months old. More than 200 others were severely ill with confirmed arsenic poisoning. An entire district of a major English city had been brought to its knees by a bag of peppermint candy. The investigation moved swiftly. Dr. John Bell and the analytical chemist Felix Remington confirmed the presence of arsenic. The chain was traced from Hardaker to Neal to Archer to Goddard to the Attic and Hodgson's shop. 3 men, Goddard, Hodgson, and Neals, were arrested and charged with manslaughter, and then at the York Assizes in December 1858, all 3 were acquitted. The prosecution could not establish that any existing law had been broken. There was no statute requiring a druggist to label toxic substances clearly. No regulation mandating that food-grade materials be stored separately from industrial chemicals. No law requiring a confectioner to disclose his ingredients or test his materials before use. No rule preventing anyone at any point in the chain from doing exactly what they had done. The judge concluded that the entire affair was a tragic accident, and under the law as it stood, he was right. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because the part of the story that changed the world comes next. Here's another question. What's the most basic safety rule in your kitchen that you take completely for granted? Nobody went to prison for the deaths of 20 people in Bradford, but the case did something that a conviction might not have. It forced an entire country to confront the fact that its food supply was governed by no rules at all. The Bradford poisoning was not the first incident of food adulteration in Britain. It wasn't even the most widespread. Throughout the 19th century, bread had been bulked with chalk and alum, tea had been colored with lead-based dyes, beer had been adulterated with strychnine, and candy had been colored with compounds containing copper, mercury, and arsenic. All of it legal, all of it undisclosed. What the Bradford case did was put a number on the consequences. 20 dead, 200 ill. Enough arsenic sold in a single evening to kill 2,000, and every link in the chain had operated within the law. Parliament could no longer argue that the market would regulate itself. 2 years after the Bradford poisoning, in 1860, Britain passed the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, the first law in the country's history to specifically address the contamination of food. The act prohibited the addition of harmful substances to food and drink, and gave authorities the power to inspect and test products sold to the public. It was, by the standards of what had come before, revolutionary. By the standards of what was needed, it was only a beginning. In 1868, Parliament passed the Pharmacy Act. For the first time, the law required that designated poisons be sold only in specially marked bottles, made of textured, colored glass so they could be identified by touch, even in a dark room. Druggists were required to keep registers recording the names of every person who purchased a listed poison. Toxic substances had to be stored separately from food-grade materials. The Attic and Shipley, with its 2 unmarked identical barrels standing side by side, became illegal. In 1874, the government abolished the sugar tax, the economic incentive that had driven confectioners to replace sugar with plaster of Paris. The practice that had created the need for daft in the first place was removed. Sugar became affordable. The substitution became unnecessary. And in 1875, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act replaced the 1860 law with stronger provisions, broader enforcement, and a framework that would evolve over the following century into the modern food safety system that governs what can and cannot be sold to the public across Europe and beyond. A Saturday evening in October 1858. A man called Humbug Billy stands behind his stall in the green market in Bradford selling peppermint lozenges that are a little darker than usual. He doesn't know why they're darker. His supplier didn't know. The sweet maker didn't know. The druggist's assistant, 3 weeks into a job he hoped would become an apprenticeship, didn't know either. Nobody in the chain knew what was in the powder because nobody was required to check. No label, no regulation, no test. No law. The next time you pick up a bag of candy, anywhere, turn it over. Read the list of ingredients printed on the back. Every substance is named. Every additive is identified. The list exists because for most of human history, country, it didn't. And because one evening in a market in northern England, that absence killed 20 people and made 200 more wish they were dead. The ingredient list doesn't tell you about Bradford. It doesn't mention Humbug Billy or the 2 unmarked barrels in the attic. It simply tells you what's inside because someone, a long time ago, made sure you would never have to guess.